You're listening to the Neurocareers Doing the Impossible podcast with Dr. K. Episode number 17, part 2. Dear Neurocareers podcast listeners, today we continue our exciting conversation with an informal cognitive scientist, an artist, and magician, Jennette Andrews. If you haven't listened to the first part of this fascinating podcast, please make sure you do it. Today, we are listening to the second part of this conversation. Thank you so much for listening. What was the most unexpected thing you discovered about human sensation or perception?
Oh my God, what a great question. I have a few that are popping to mind. I think there's a rather basic answer of like a lot of things that magicians would say in terms of like the way that spectators and participants in magic show behave in terms of like the instructions that they're given, sort of the trial and error that work, sort of process that works. So, that's always interesting. I think for me, I have not done as much on this since COVID, but I used to be very involved in doing magic with smell and working a lot with scent. So for a while, and again, I have not been as actively involved in this in the last couple of years, but not even in terms of a magic sense, but this was just something that I learned through then my own just looking into this because of magic, is smell became something that people learned a lot about more during COVID, but is still like so mysterious to the general population and is still, it's the least, it receives the least funding and the least amount of attention of any, sort of sensory perceptual realm. I never cease to be amazed by the things that I learn about the sense of smell. And even just very basic pieces of information like, again, this isn't a magic thing. This is just a person thing, like how different foods essentially have different proportions of what we understand as, taste or flavor rather, coming from their smell versus their actual like chemical stimulation of taste buds. Like, for example, apples, most of their flavor is actually coming through their smell and not so much from like what your tongue is actually sensing, as opposed to other foods. Like I think it's chocolate where it's like the opposite, where like you're not smelling as much, but there's more. I might be wrong on the chocolate thing, but there's other foods where like you cannot smell it, but you'll still taste it more. And very interesting different things like that, the way that the airflow circulates in your nostrils at different speeds and just all these different things that just in terms of the pure sensation of the body, that are just these very little obscure tidbits of knowledge that one picks up in the type of work that I make is often about niche sensory perception that I end up just kind of reading a lot about. And the body is just incredible. And I think that's really amazing.
Yes, absolutely. And I think this is your uniqueness. Yes, your niche is really investigating that sensation, sensory perception and different modalities. Yes, and you looked at smell. There is more and more research on smell.
Right.
And some papers diagnosing or to helping to diagnose Parkinson's disease because of the change in smell, and also for people who come from war with different mental challenges and memories. There is cognitive therapy and where the smells are used to evoke certain memories but provide this in a safe environment. So people would stop associating this with the traumatic events necessarily. Yes, I think Dr. Baidel at the University of Central Florida is running this program, and they're using smells very actively in that program. So I'm saying just, connecting.
I'm gonna look into that.
Yes.
This is no, I feel like I've read so much about about different studies going on as well, but the idea of using, if I'm following correctly, almost like smell as exposure therapy
Yes.
for PTSD
Yes.
sounds like I'm like, oh my God, I really want to read this paper now.
Yes, yeah, they have the whole program, and it's one very successful as far as I know. So,
That's
yes,
amazing.
absolutely. And here the question of actually technology comes in. And this also some of the things that Dr. Barnhart referred to. The magicians, they use the technology sometimes even in a bigger extent than scientists. Yes. So, where did you get introduced to the technology, and how did it develop to your newest exhibition, which is actually the use of AI? Yes. So, can you tell us about that?
Yeah. So it's interesting because I, for my whole career, really explicitly did not use technology and was, I don't want to say disinterested in it, but basically, because it's the Arthur C. Clarke law. Any sufficiently advanced technology is indistinguishable from magic. So for me, the fact is like, my iPhone sitting here, this is magic. This is magic. I don't know how most of this is working. And this is an incredible tool. But I did my first project related to technology as not a magic piece. It was during COVID, and I kind of was tasked with creating what could be a safe way for people to experience an artistic project. And I had known some app developers who had designed a platform that was augmented reality, but just for audio. So it's not the visual AR, not like a Pokemon Go thing that people think of visual AR in the world. But this was sound. And I've always been very interested in sound. I fell in love with experimental music and the history of experimental music in my early teens, probably when I was 14, 15. So I've been very interested in interesting ways that people use sound. So I ended up developing a work that was first a commission for the Museum of Contemporary Art Chicago, later for the Quebec City Biennial, called Invisible Museums of the Unseen, which is a GPS triggered, almost like choose your own adventure audio augmented reality piece. So basically, what it is, imagine walking into a park, and instead of it being, an empty or semi-empty park, there's actually an entire architectural structure of a museum in that empty park. People would show up to the park, put their headphones in, open the app, and then essentially kind of walk into the park, and you would hear what was almost like a museum audio guide, but it was done in a choose your own adventure format, so that depending on whichever paths you would take in a walking park, it would be like wandering a museum. You might wander into a different exhibit and then leave that one and wander into a different one. So it was all GPS activated based on how you were walking. But then sort of the part of it, and part of it certainly that relates more scientific way and sort of a sensory illusion way, was there were aspects of it. Every, park site, museum site dealt with sort of a scientific or physiological concept of invisibility. So, for example, there was like the Invisible Museum of Gravity, and that had 4 exhibits in it that dealt with things like space time, microgravity, etc. So people kind of walk through, and you'd almost hear, I made these sort of exhibits that were almost like a history of the science of something, but also combined with like this weird layered audio of kind of almost like poetic kind of language. And then eventually people would have the option to kind of go explore like a gallery space. And then this was something where then some of these like auditory illusions kind of came into play, where either we were creating spaces that, replicated people walking into like an airlock for the space station. So we had, I'd have something where I had people have, their headphones in, and you would hear, but not really, like a barely audible frequency that was like a very intense hum. And then you'd walk further basically across a field, and then the hum would get like a little less intense, and it was then you walk further, and then eventually it would like drop off. And so it was made to feel almost like you were in this like depressurized environment. And because of the way that I ended up engineering the audio, it actually gives a physical sensation. So you would get to a certain point, it was like your stomach would drop out when the audio would cut out. It was a really weird, like physical sensation. So I started playing around, I spent all of 2020 and then much of last year, making these things. So that was my first kind of foray into doing anything with technology. That certainly was not predating anything that the public wasn't aware of, but, sort of an early adopter, I think, certainly, started working on this, became aware of it in 2019 and, brought the piece to fruition in mid 2020. But my newest piece, taken by artificial surprise, deals with magic, machine learning, and surprise. And so this is something that then for me, I ended up starting that I started the research on it in, let me think, I guess it was 2021, because as the greatest unexpected joy in my life, I was named an affiliate of Meta Lab at Harvard, and which is a digital humanities kind of, I think they label themselves an idea foundry. It's basically a think tank of people in digital humanities and people, also a lot of artists working in both tech and installation and participatory art. And then, kind of a scholarship in sometimes anthropology, things like that. So basically, that group had become aware of, we had been in touch about my Invisible Museums piece. And through the confluence of amazing events, I got to, kind of become part of this community. Through conversation with a couple of people there, became aware of the 1950 Alan Turing paper on computational intelligence. And somebody in our group encouraged me to read it. It's where he invents the imitation game and, poses these really interesting, the central question to what gives rise to our modern ideas about machine learning. And how do we think about, surprise, and how, can a machine take us by surprise? So that became an interesting question to me, especially because I, as a magician, became deeply fascinated by studying surprise in 2017. I was doing a piece that was a commission for the Museum of Contemporary Art Chicago, and I started really trying to figure out why certain pieces of magic were more surprising than others. Already been thinking on this for years anyway, but then it came to the fore. And then flash forward to 2019, I discovered a paper by Thomas Griffiths, who is a psychology researcher. I can't remember what university he's with now, but he wrote this paper. I believe the title is Ontological Commitments in Object Transformations in Magic. And basically, his paper answered what I had been thinking about for like, decades in my life. And he, kind of does this really interesting study why viewers of magic performances find certain transformations of objects. He talks about it not in terms of surprise, he talks about it in terms of interestingness. And so he talks about essentially these hierarchies of surprise. It's really fascinating. The experiments he ran were really interesting. So I became very interested in this paper again, like right before COVID, and then ended up reading the Turing paper. So I'm kind of having a lot of input happening about surprise. And then one of the directors, or he's a former director of the Harvard Meta Lab group, was like, the imitation game that Turing, proposes, he's like, a lot of the aesthetic that he kind of describes is very similar to a lot of Victorian parlor games. And that's sort of his reference point for it. Is there a relationship between Victorian parlor games, like Turing is kind of dancing with, and Victorian parlor magic? If so, A is, because we have at that point we had never met. This is like a, COVID collaboration. And he's like, is that something that's in your wheelhouse? And B, is using, parlor magic, is that an interesting way to explore surprise and machine learning? And I was like, oh my God, yes. And so basically then that was the birth. By the way, that person's name is Matthew Battles. He's the most well-read person I've ever met in my life. It is unreal and just a beautiful thinker. He's an anthropologist, and just, oh my God. So after having a lot of conversations with Matthew about this, thinking about going back to Turing's original questions and can a machine take a human by surprise? Why or why not? We talked to people across a wide spectrum. We talked to Sarah Schwettman, who she's actually in neuroscience, I believe at Yale right now, but was talking about some of the work that her lab has been doing, kind of vision and machine learning and artistic practice and some of the work she's been doing. We talked to people in psychology, talked to, people in philosophy, all these ideas on, can a machine take a human by surprise? And then conversely, can a human surprise a machine? We ended up discarding that question because it was so behemoth. But basically, then that started me working on this project of saying, can I work with a programmer to create an algorithm that will sort of describe new magic effects or novel magic effects, almost with varying levels of surprise factors? So I worked with an amazing programmer and trying to then train an algorithm based on historic magic catalogs. We used the 1899 Martinka and Company magic catalog so that it was only descriptions of magic effects, because I didn't want to, if any of this ever got published, it wasn't ethical for me to like expose magic effects. So basically taking that in and doing a whole bunch of stuff and essentially having different text descriptions of magic effects created via machine learning. And then for my sort of performance task of it was going, okay, now I have these text descriptions. Now I have to use my like human historical and technical knowledge to figure out how to perform in real life the descriptions that are output. So that's basically what Taken by Artificial Surprise was me performing some of the pieces that were our algorithmically generated outputs, the ways that I devised to create and perform those, and then performing them alongside historic pieces of magic. And essentially, it was a giant Turing test of that everybody, you would see pieces of magic that were created with the help of machine learning, and you would see pieces of magic that were only made, via humans 100 years ago. And you would not be sure which was which. Magic inherently has a strangeness to it. And this is something certainly we see right now, in a lot of like AI generated art, which I have a lot of opinions about, but there is that strangeness. Magic already has that strangeness. And so then when you're presented with, well, what's algorithmically generated, what's human, what's exclusively human made, can you tell the difference? And then what to me is the interesting part is why or why not? And that's where you get into the ontological commitments we have about objects, ideas about the very fine-grained structure of surprise and how that unfolds in the human mind that is very different than a computer.
That's absolutely amazing. What did you learn from the reactions of people who came to the show? What was the most surprising for you, or maybe unexpected?
Yeah, I guess I was surprised by the spectrum of thoughts on essentially what was, there were some people who were like, oh, well, it's very clear that this thing and this, this part of the performance and this part of the performance were clearly exclusively human made. And I think the others were machine generated. And people were like, some people were very firm in their opinions. And other people were like, would come up to me afterwards and be like, tell me, I want to know. Like, I don't know. And so I thought it was very interesting that some people were very certain and other people were completely uncertain. That to me was exciting. I mean, I made it as a piece to just be not provocative in a way of, being startled, but I designed it to be a thought experiment. And so when people were reflecting on it, that I was like, oh, okay, people are questioning what they're seeing. And so that was really exciting to me.
Absolutely, absolutely. Are you still planning on getting the show on the road, or will it be? I know that it was performed in New York just recently. Will it be still shown to people?
I hope so. I hope so. I'm just going through, actually, this is my plan for tonight and tomorrow. I'm just going through the, photos and videos from it. I'd love to see it happen somewhere else. It's certainly very different than any sort of magic performance that we think of and different than any theatrical work. I mean, this was designed, I did it as part of, I was the artist in residence for Culture Lab in New York. And so, they had basically a warehouse scale space that I could take over. And so it was an installation art piece. So we had large scale installations of, textiles that had the algorithmically generated text. And I'm talking, 25-foot tall hanging textiles. And then there was a short film component to it as well. So it was definitely, it's not sort of a monolith of just a performance. There's a lot of kind of moving pieces to it, but I'd be really interested to see what it would look like somewhere else.
Yes, I'm sure there are many people and also scientists and interested in machine learning who would be interested to
Yeah.
do that. And now that you mentioned several times the rise of ideas and how you are discussing the ideas. What does it take for you to generate idea? Is it only you? Is it, do you need involvement from other people? How does this process of creativity works for you? Where do you get those creative juices? And then idea is one thing, and often people have some ideas, but very often what I see in my practice when I coach people on their careers, very often they don't implement those ideas, which doesn't seem to be the case for you. So what does it take to get from the idea to the full fruition of it? So those two questions. Yeah.
Short answer, no sleep. I was gonna say I'm kidding, but I'm also kind of not kidding. So in terms of creativity, that's one of those things that to a certain extent I can't answer, right? Like I was talking about this with a friend of mine who's a really brilliant author. Her name is Jennifer Cation Armstrong. She writes really amazing, essentially books on culture and television and the way in which certain TV shows have impacted modern society. New York Times bestselling author for like many of her books. And we were talking about this the other day of like, she runs a lot of workshops for writers who are looking to become nonfiction writers. And, there are certain aspects of a process that you can teach, but then, like at a certain point, you also just have to kind of just start doing stuff. And whether that be starting to write something, whether that be, for me, just saying, okay, I'm going to sit here and I'm just going to start practicing this thing and it's probably going to look bad and I just have to sit here and figure something out. I think there's almost a physical component to it where you just have to kind of start doing the thing and then see what happens. That's not like a sexy or glamorous answer, but it's just kind of true, at least for me and for a lot of other people I know. In terms of like inspiration, that's one thing that I feel wildly fortunate to have as a big part of my life is that because of what I do, having a lot of, sort of different components to it, I am constantly trying to go and learn as much as I can about a bunch of different things, whether that be saying, oh, I'm going to go to a scientific lecture, or I'm going to go to the Guggenheim, or I'm going to read a book about, right now I'm reading a book on fact checking and what constitutes factual information. And it's like written by performance artists and the New York Times fact checkers. Like, really, so it's like, you know, where in some sense people might be like, oh, that seems very out of left field. But all of my like work is about, I have a whole piece that I perform where like almost the entire script for it is, are you certain? And magic deals with certainty. It deals with what we process as factual information or not, and how those things change. So for me, being interested in something like how the cultural mechanisms at play to what constitutes fact, the creation of what we think of as factual information or not, that's working, as is going to a museum exhibit and looking at the way that their installation design is made, as is going to a lecture about the history of smell, or something like that. So it's just trying to constantly absorb as much information as I can about things that maybe are adjacent to what I do, sometimes maybe don't seem. And that way, I think that's what keeps, fresh and exciting information coming before your eyes. And then it gets to a certain point where then you go, okay, now I just have to sit here and make some stuff. I think in terms of like the execution of it, again, I've just been really fortunate in my life that like, for example, like taken by artificial surprise, I had applied for a New York State Cultural Arts grant last year to execute that project. And I basically told myself, if I get the grant, I'll do it. And I didn't expect to get the grant by sheer luck or happenstance. A whole bunch of things came together and ended up getting the funding to do the project, and then got the residency space to do the project. So there's a lot of things like that, but I am always very actively I have a wonderful like network of people that are very supportive. That's the biggest part of any of it, like you and I have been talking about the whole time, is it is the support and the mentorship and the help of those around one, and how, and too the inspiration that they provide too, of friends and people saying, oh hey, have you looked at this book, or oh hey, here's this this artist I think you might think is doing some cool video art or whatever. It's just always trying to keep stuff coming in.
Yes, so all that freshness, you are maintaining it all the time. And probably you trust your intuition. Is that true?
Yeah. Whether or not I trust it all the time is a different question. Whether or not I go with it, yes.
Yes.
I always go with it. Whether or not I have a lot of doubt, I may doubt it a lot. But that too, to me, though, is something that just comes with a lot of experience. I mean, again, I've been just so fortunate in that I've been performing and been, in front of people my whole life. I mean, I have two memories of being alive before not being a magician. So, I mean, I remember, I think like, you know, bumping my grandmother's old coffee table, like as like a 3 or 4 year old. And then I remember going for a ride in my great grandmother's car. Um, Other than that, I have no conception of myself outside of what I do. And so, so I think that sort of experience, when you're just constantly, when it's sort of constant trial and error all the time, you do start to develop a sense of like, that failed. So that maybe isn't going to work so great that way, or that failed, but I know why and I know how to fix it in the future. So maybe it's still worth doing something like this, but I know how to fix it. So I think there's also just a lot of that stuff that in a way turns into instinct through experience.
Mhm. Yes, absolutely. And I think this leads to the question, the main question of our podcast about doing the impossible.
Mm.
Because this actually thread of doing the impossible goes through your work. I saw the exhibition, How to Battle the Impossible.
Yeah.
The presentation of Impossible
Yeah.
with Jennette Andrews.
Yeah.
How to do the impossible? That's
That's what everybody wants to know.
what to do. How to do it?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's one of the really interesting things about magic is we all, I think there is this in sort of innate human desire to try to do the impossible, whether we look at things, and I know nothing about this, but I assume this is part of like superhero culture and wanting to do, whether that be superhuman feats or whether that be, even things that seem impossible, like getting an advanced degree or, moving to a new country by yourself or, different things like that that sort of seem impossible, but we do have a model for in, humanity. But, I think magic does have an interesting lens on that because you're essentially trying to create sort of simulated versions of what looks impossible. And so, in a way, like, if you see a magician levitate something, are they truly defying the laws of gravity? No. And we know this. Rational people, we understand this. But, there is such a craving for that extension beyond. And I think magic does provide an interesting vehicle and an interesting set of tools and a very sort of nonlinear problem solving structure for saying, here's something that with the current like laws of nature should be impossible or should seem impossible. How do I make something that makes it seem like this thing that's impossible is happening? That I think being the core of, the field that I'm in extends to a lot of other things as well. I mean, I can't speak to other fields because I haven't been in one, but there is a lot in the world that does, seem impossible in some way. But, a lot of times it's like, well, certainly with magic, it's like, okay, well, if you end up, doing some really funky engineering, then maybe you can make this thing look possible. If you, build something that looks like this, and then you have a lot of knowledge on some very serious subtle psychology, and then you're also, know how to write a script so that you're, whatever, then you're like, okay, yeah, I actually can make something that looks like it should be impossible, but it looks real. So, so I think that's something that, by and large, that magic really, really teaches us.
Thank you so much, Jeanette. Can you tell our listeners where they can find information about you, maybe how they can contact you and even see the things you do?
Yeah, I would love that. So everything is pretty much just my name. It's Jeanette, like my website is JennetteAndrews.com, JeaneTtte, Andrews.com. For anybody who's more interested, obviously I do a lot of, performance work for different, company talks and things like that. That's more that website. You'll also see a link to my artistic portfolio, which is more what we've been speaking on. And then really the most up-to-date thing I have is my Instagram, which is at Jennette Andrews Magic. And that's a pretty regularly updated, sometimes basically daily. So yeah, I'd love to hear from your listeners. I know you have cultivated a great community of very interesting people.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. And one more now person in our community, and I'm so grateful for you to come and
thank you.
speak.
Thank you for having me on.
Yeah, that was a great, great, great pleasure. And I wish you all possible success in doing the impossible.
Oh, thank you.